Well, hi everybody. This is Truth Seeker, and I guess most of you know by this point that Oxygen, the Oxygen channel on my cable, it's channel 81, but they're airing a 4-hour special featured by investigative journalist Trey Bundy on the incident of sexual child abuse in the Jehovah's Witnesses and the factors that make Jehovah's Witnesses particularly vulnerable to the problem of sexual child abuse. Their policies, the fact that they're a high controlled organization, that they're very insular, they don't trust outside agencies because Satan is ruling this world. It's very much like the Bible students, the same mindset that all institutions really can't be trusted because Satan is really the prince, as Russell would call it, the prince of this present evil world. Witnesses use more of a modern language, but they believe the same thing. They believe that Satan runs the world. And so they've formed their own theocracy. They are the only legitimate government on earth, and they think of themselves as a government. And the governing body are the spokespersons that have been selected by Jehovah to guide, spiritually guide the 8.5 million Jehovah's Witnesses across the world. And they're very, because of the nature of the organization, Russell set it up as a corporation, ran it like a business, had hopes, according to Macmillan, A.H. Macmillan, who was a director and a key early player in the formation of the Bible Students movement, making it a success. He indicated that it was Russell's, in his book Faith on the March, that Russell had a grand vision for the organization and that he was privy to a private discussion with Russell just weeks before Russell died about what Russell's vision for the Watchtower organization was. And he and Van Amberg and Rutherford, when Russell passed away, an untimely death at the age of 64, in 1916, October 31st, 1916, he passed away, and Rutherford took the reins. A lot of controversy over that history. Personally, I think that I think there's a lot of quarterbacking on Monday sort of thing, looking back at Rutherford, even within the witnesses themselves, realize that Rutherford was an ambitious, egotistical person who was really more interested in his own welfare over the welfare of others, and his position in the organization and building the organization up into something that he had a vision for. Although I think his vision probably was molded and shaped by Russell's vision, and certainly by Macmillan and Van Amberg, especially early on, who understood what Russell's intent was for the organization. And so I think they did follow basically what Russell had in mind, maybe not exactly the way he had in mind. Rutherford was a brutal man, but I think the end product turned out to be pretty much what Russell had hoped the thing to be. And there's no question that there's this very separatist sense within both the Bible students and within the Jehovah's Witnesses of being separate from the world, and that they are the only ones recognized by God. Not that the Bible students believe that the witnesses are recognized by God. There's a big gulf between the two. The Bible students believe that they maintained the pure truth, and that Rutherford was seduced by the dark side, if you want to call it that. Rutherford was tainted by worldly ambition, and he went into outer darkness. And so the Bible students don't accept witnesses in general as being God's organization. And Bible students aren't even recognized as existing at all by the Watchtower Society. They've grown to such a large size that they ignore any of the remnant of the Bible students movement that's left. And there isn't much. I think the greater part of the movement is in Europe at this point, mostly in Eastern Europe. And certainly there's been a very, very steady and strong decline in the United States. But as the Watchtower became more centralized in its control over the membership in general, over the individual ecclesias, they even changed the terminology to try and separate themselves a little bit from their past identity. They came up with kingdom halls. You see, previously there were no regular meeting places. They did have the temples in New York and in Chicago. I think there may have been a temple in L.A. too. I have to refresh myself on that in the bigger cities. But most of the ecclesias from the formation of the Bible students movement to the final separation in the late 1920s, early 1930s between the, let's say, the Russell loyalists versus the Watchtower loyalists. They were meeting in rented halls, and Bible students continued that tradition, whereas the Jehovah's Witnesses began building their own meeting halls. They wouldn't call them churches. They call them kingdom halls. That was in the middle 1930s when that occurred. But both groups are very, very insular. They don't trust the world. They don't trust people in the world. They believe that Satan is behind everything and everyone, so they don't form very much trust. They have more trust within the brotherhood, and they don't advocate individuals getting counseling very much. I mean, yeah, there are Bible students that do that, but it's really not looked upon very. You're a weak person if you need help, let's say, from a worldly source, because you didn't trust in God. You're not a very strong Bible student. And Jehovah's Witnesses have the same outlook with regard to outside agencies, that governments and so on, they believe themselves to be the only legitimate theocracy or the government on earth, and that when God does away with this evil world through the process of Armageddon, he's going to wipe out billions, literally billions of people, according to Watchtower dogma, and through a horrific event, Armageddon, and he's going to spare the faithful witnesses, and they will be the ones that inherit the earth. And then when the earth is cleared and prepared, the body's buried, there will be a resurrection of all people who God deems worthy of a resurrection, and they'll be tested during the 1,000-year kingdom for life. And they have a kind of a similar idea as the Bible students about what the purpose of the kingdom is, although the breadth of it is not as let's say as successful on the part of the Jehovah's Witnesses, because they believe many billions of people will die through this sifting process, Armageddon and the kingdom. And Bible students tend to believe that the greater part of humanity will be saved. Although how much of humanity is saved is really unknown, and the Bible students believe that a fairly significant number will go into the second death, or everlasting oblivion, which is a similar idea to the Jehovah's Witnesses. But they don't trust people. They don't trust anything outside of the witnesses, and that makes them vulnerable because they only trust individuals within the organization. And if you have predators within the organization, they're going to be trusted more than, let's say, somebody in the world, so children will be exposed, more vulnerable to exposure to individuals that have this illness, this mental illness of pedophilia. By the way, that's an incurable. I don't think that there's been really any much success in rehabilitating pedophiles. I think that the data and the studies that have been conducted on them have shown that they're pretty much irretrievable. That this is something that they're not cured of, whereas other mental disorders, personality disorders and such, can be dealt with fairly successfully using therapy and other psychological approaches. But the witnesses don't trust the police. They're very formalistic. They are their own government. They believe that they're the only legitimate government in the world, and that they will be the core government that is established on earth after Armageddon is done, and that they are to obey Caesar's rule, as Jesus mentioned in the New Testament. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. And so basically they're of the belief that they should obey the laws of the land, but where the laws conflict with their beliefs, that's where they run into some troubles. And So they don't think of things in terms of criminal actions so much. And you hear this a lot among activists, that witnesses think more in terms of sin, and that sin is something that can be rehabilitated. They're very formalistic. Not many of them are well trained because they don't believe in higher criticism. They don't believe in higher education. They believe that there's a danger in obtaining higher education, that you may believe in evolution, or you may become an atheist as a result of going to college. And so you're putting yourself into Satan's world by going to college, and putting yourself in jeopardy of being influenced by satanic ideas that will bring you away from the truth. And so they're hesitant about, very, very opposed to education, or even mixed marriage. They call it unequally yoked. Bible students are the same way. It's better to marry within the truth. And that's the idea of the witnesses. They're very insular. They're self-contained. The Watchtower has created a bunch of rules. This is something that has grown over the years. Rutherford was a lawyer, let's put it that way, and his mark, let's say, I think they said of Newton, we know the lion by his claw on a particular problem, the Bachistochrome problem it was, that was sent around by Johann Bernoulli around the world, and finally it made its way to Newton, and he solved it anonymously, inventing a whole branch of mathematics in the process called calculus of the variations, and then sent it back, and anonymously on the day before it was due, and he solved it actually the night before the deadline for that was given to solve the problem. And Johann Bernoulli, I think it was Johann or Jacob, one of the two, it was one of the Bernoulli brothers, who said, we know the lion by his claw. So that's the mark that Rutherford left on the witnesses, because they're very formalistic, very legalistic. They have lots of rules. There are consequences and punishments that go along with the rules, and it's a very controlled lifestyle, and they have a very strong hierarchical structure where the governing body is at the top, and the elders really are the key element that makes the whole thing work, because they're the representation of the centralized governing body. They are the representatives of the governing body at the local level, at the congregational level. And so they enforce all of the rules and the culture, the expectations. They're sort of the police that make sure that the laity, that everybody is obeying the expectations laid out by the Watchtower organization. They have been in recent years distancing themselves from the name Watchtower, and they not too long ago formed a corporation called the Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, but it's the same thing, that it's just one more legal entity, a corporation that represents the the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, which really was the core society. In fact, they still, most of their properties, most of the operational end of things is done under the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of either Pennsylvania or under New York. And both of them are billion-dollar corporations. If you look at the 900T forms that you can find online, there's some that are relatively recent that talk about, there's a box there that says, list the assets of this organization, and in total between the two corporations, there is something like $2.6 billion in assets, and I think it really goes much more than that. I think they're not a very financially transparent organization. But these rules that they have to obey, they're contained mainly in a book called Shepherding the Flock of God. Most of you all know about it, and especially the two-witness rule. Bible students have a similar rule. I remember as a kid growing up that if there were accusations between brethren, then it had to be taken up, the matter between at least 2 or 3 witnesses in order to establish the veracity of what was of the accusations, of the dialogue, and how it was handled by the elders. It wasn't as formalistic as the Watchtower, because the Watchtower, they set up formal committees, judicial committees. They have hearings. The elders that sit on these judicial committees then try basically let's say the accused, and they have to make a decision as to whether or not the violation was punishable by disfellowshipping or some other punishment. They have some lesser forms of punishment. I think revoking privileges. There are other things. I think they have to make an announcement whether, if they didn't get disfellowship, there's an announcement made that this person was reproved by the elders. And so there's a whole process by which either the disfellowship person or the reproved person has to come back in, has to perform to come back into good graces with the group, with the church, with the congregation. And so they treat everything as if all things are forgivable and redeemable. And it goes back to their basic doctrine, because everybody's been redeemed and freed by Adam's transgression. We're all inherited sin from Adam's transgression, so none are not guilty. We're all guilty of sin, at just a level of sin, and so that there's a measure of reproof and punishment that goes along, admonition, and to bring us back into the fold. Both Bible students and Watchtower believe in that approach, although again, Watchtower is much more formalistic about it, and they keep these records. Well, the two-witness rule applies to any allegations that are levied against an individual, and that's where the problem really sits, besides the insular culture and the lack of distrust of outside entities, policing, medicine, government, they also require in certain situations that two witnesses verify the truth of the allegation. And if you don't have the two witnesses, then the whole matter has to be overlooked. And so in most cases of child sexual abuse, first the child doesn't know really what to say or if they should say anything. They're children, for goodness sakes, and they don't know what's better. Sometimes they won't know until many years later, when they're adults, that what happened to them was a criminal act. And it does, especially it really can affect an individual psychologically. Being sexually abused, there is a tremendous amount of psychological damage that's done to an individual and their self-esteem when they're sexually abused. And the Watchtower, they don't take that into account. They don't understand the nature, the degree to which the harm is that comes to a person who's been sexually abused, and how it affects their self-esteem, and these individuals end up on a path that's often very self-destructive. And so it becomes a never-ending spiral for these victims, because as they grow older, they tend to rebel. They tend to rebel in ways that are counter to the culture. So then they're further in trouble, because they may smoke, they may drink, they may get tattoos, they may end up growing their hair long, they may curse. They start doing things that rebel against the culture that they've been raised to adopt and believe and live. And so rather than understanding that this is part of the psychological harm, that this acting out is part of the psychological harm that has come to these individuals as a result of the sexual abuse, they further punish and victimize these people because of their actions, rather than having love and empathy and sympathy. They make them outcasts, and they call them bad association. And this happens in the Bible students too. I was one of the bad association. There was a letter written to our ecclesia and read in front of the ecclesia about my brothers and I when we were teenagers. We were rebelling. Both me, I had two younger brothers, and we were all rebelling against the culture, the lifestyle. We felt penned in. We listened to rock and roll. We started smoking, taking drugs, my brothers in particular, alcohol and other things. And there was another family in the ecclesia that was a large family that came from Saskatchewan, Canada, that were very, very isolated, and they came to the Dawn, which is in Rutherford, New Jersey, just outside of New York City. And they found out about some of the things that my brothers and I had done, because teenage boys, they had teenage boys. and teenage kids try to gravitate to one another. And if anyway, there were certain incidents that occurred, and it turned out that I guess one day they allowed their oldest boy to spend a day with my brothers in Nyack, New York, on the Clearwater. And the Clearwater was a ship that sailing vessel, a sloop, that was owned by Arlo Guthrie and Pete Seeger. And they sailed up and down to all the different port cities on the Hudson River, doing concerts and doing other advocacy work on cleaning up the Hudson River. The name of the boat was the Clearwater. And they did that for many years. And you could go and visit the ship when they came into port. And my brothers did. And Arlo Guthrie smoked pot. My brothers smoked pot. There was a lot of, and so this appalled the one boy, the one teen that they invited to come with them. He came back and he reported to his mother what he had seen, and they decided that they had had enough, that we were bad association for their children, that they were moving out of the Dawn. They had been at the Dawn for maybe a year, that they were leaving the Dawn, and that we were the main reason, and they named us boys as being the key reason for their leaving, and they named us specifically. And this letter was read by the elders in front of the whole ecclesia, and no one raised a hand in our defense. My parents didn't. I think it embarrassed my parents. It put my dad's eldership in jeopardy, because the ecclesia elected the elders, and so that put my dad in jeopardy for losing his eldership, and it embarrassed my mother, although my mother was totally psychotic. She was the one that actually sexually abused me as a child. It was my own mother. Took me a long time to get over that, and I harbored repugnant feelings. She was repugnant to me for my whole life, and I didn't understand where that came from, but I do now. And even with 15 years of therapy, it's difficult for me to deal with that situation. I mean, I have my own life, I have my family, I'm happier now than I've ever been before, although my health hasn't always held up very well. And lately, in the last couple of months, I'm fearing that my heart condition has actually declined. I had a heart attack 3 years ago. I underwent through a battery of tests. But anyway, that's tangential. But I'm trying to give an idea of the culture, the idea of what it's like, and that I understand what it's like. The Bible students aren't that terribly different from the Watchtower, and that these victims are re-victimized, and the way that it's handled by the elders, it puts the individual who's been victimized, re-victimizes them again. They're made to sit in front of the individual that abused them, and make the allegations directly in front of that individual. They have to detail all of the experience to an incredibly intrusive level of how much penetration. Was there penetration? Was there an orgasm? Did you enjoy it? I mean, there are all kinds of questions, intrusive questions that are being handled by these elders who are not equipped and not trained, not educated to handle these circumstances. And that's one of the I think lack of insight on the part of the British. What's IPEC, the one that Lloyd Evans is a part of, and legislation. He just recently made a video talking about that there's legislation that's being drafted on sexual abuse within institutions like Watchtower, and one of the recommendations was that the elders receive training. Well, if they really understood the culture, it's hard for me to see how that could be implemented successfully because of the culture, because of the mindset and the way Watchtower treats child sexual abuse as a sin rather than a criminal act. But anyway, Trey Bundy really goes into a great amount of detail in this documentary on specific cases, but these cases are representative of the organization in whole. And as I was watching yesterday, and it's on again tonight, I saw there's some interesting elements to this thing because of the way the Watchtower is so let's say, I don't know, litigious in a way. They're very officious. They everything. There's a form for everything. There's everything is documented. Everything is there's a whole file on each and every member from the time that they became members or from the time they were born. There are these records that are kept on all these individuals, and they dust them out when something happens, and they bring them out, and they keep them updated, and these things also capture child sexual abuse. These records that they keep. And so when somebody makes an allegation of child sexual abuse, they have to complete a very detailed questionnaire and form that is used to record this incident and circumstance. It gets sent to the branch, and the branch is the centralized authority of the Watchtower Society. And so these records, there's a database of these records that is kept. And there's some question as to how large this database is. In Australia, when the Royal Commission was convened against the Watchtower's society, there were a little over 1,000 records that were found and subpoenaed and turned over to the Australian government. While even though Watchtower opposed these turning over these records, somehow Australia imposed this upon them and were able to obtain these records. And so there were 1,000 cases on file, and about 70,000 Jehovah's Witnesses in Australia altogether. And when you look at the percentage, that's about 1.4% of Jehovah's Witnesses. So 1,000 to 70,000, the ratio is about 1.4%. Now there's a there's a controversy that's boiling over in the United States because there is a list, a record of all of the sexual abuse in the United States, and there's some I've heard different numbers, but they're all relatively pretty much in the same order of magnitude. There's an article that I recently picked up that indicated that there were 23,720 records on this list, on this database of incidents of child sexual abuse within the Jehovah's Witnesses in the United States, with over 1 million members in the United States. The 23,720 constitutes about 1.9 or 2%, roughly 2% of all Jehovah's Witnesses in the U.S. So, it's in that 1.4 to 2% range. And these are reported incidents. I would venture to say that far more cases are not reported, just because of the stigma that would be associated. I mean, there's the threat of being called bad association or being victimized. You have to just basically keep your mouth shut when you've been made a victim, because Jehovah is watching and he'll take care of it in the end. And why drag Jehovah's name through the mud is the common phrase that's used in these circumstances. And so it's such a shame. But this is something that's not really well understood, even in secular terms. I pulled up an article in Psychology Today on child sexual abuse, and they said that the incidence of child sexual abuse in the United States is not well understood. But they believe that it's somewhere in the neighborhood or under 5%. Well, if it's in the neighborhood of 5%, well, that means that there are quite a few unreported cases within the Jehovah's Witnesses, because 5% of 1.2 million Jehovah's Witnesses in the United States would be somewhere around 60,000. So almost 2/3 of the cases, potential cases of child sexual abuse, go unreported to the elders. And again, the stigma associated with it, the direction of the Watchtower, the two-witness rule, makes it so that these do not get reported to the proper officials who can handle these things, the police and counselors and so on. And so the Watchtower has given explicit instructions discouraging reporting these allegations of child sexual abuse to the police and to outside agencies. And these directions have been given to the elders across the globe, really. Now, if you have 8.5 million people, and you take your upper limit of child sex abuse at being 5%, as suggested by the Psychology Today article that you can find readily, just do a Google search on Psychology Today, child sexual abuse incidents, or frequency or something like that, and you'll get this article or a similar article, because there are quite a few articles on that subject. That would amount to 425,000 cases of child sexual abuse within the society in total and globally, and that is, that's approaching 500,000. That is a huge number. I think this is something that certainly is unreported in the Bible students. I know I certainly never mentioned anything to anybody about what happened with me and my own mother. There was an embarrassment there. I wouldn't talk about it. I never, in fact, I didn't talk about it. I didn't even mention it to my wife until fairly recently, that I had been sexually abused by my mother. And she kind of put things together on her own, and I finally got brave enough to talk about the circumstance with my counselor. One thing that is difficult, counselors often aren't trained to deal with cults and cult thinking and what they do to individuals to repress certain things, to repress the notion of discussing things like sexual abuse. In fact, I noticed the other day in a video that Lloyd made where he used the word fuck. And you notice he had to make note that that he rarely uses swear words in his videos, and I think he indicated because he's sensitive to newer individuals who are coming out or questioning their faith in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and that that foul language may unnecessarily tip the balance in the wrong way for them, and so he's careful not to use bad language. But I would also venture that just he has an inner let's say, break on using foul language. Anyway, I know I met Lloyd, and he doesn't use foul language. He is a very well-spoken individual, and he doesn't he just simply doesn't use swear words. I probably do more of it at home on my own than he probably does. And I feel the stigma of using swear words. I'm very aware of avoiding them in my videos, and there's no need for that. I mean, I watch Matt Dillahunty all the time, and he just throws them out left and right, telling people, go get screwed. And so, in my circumstance with my counselor, I had a hard time talking about sex. I still do. I have difficulty talking about, even talking about the sexual abuse that I suffered at the hands of my mother. It took all of the courage and strength within me to actually talk about it, and still do. It wasn't like a weight was lifted when I did talk about it. It was like, well, I got over that hurdle, but there's a real block there. There's a feeling that I just want to avoid talking about it. There's an embarrassment. There's a feeling of I am defective that is associated with that topic and that subject. And so I think that there are lasting impressions, lasting personality changes and personality and characteristic traits that are permanent, that have been molded by our experience in the cult, that dictates our behavior, regardless, because of our uneasiness and the discomfort that we feel when we talk about these subjects. And so that's I think that's as a result, a direct result of our the repeated brainwashing, basically. I mean, that's really what you have to call it, brainwashing, indoctrination that takes place from the time you're a child for the duration until you finally do make the break to leave. And I'm not sure how I made that break. I don't know if I would have ever left the Bible students had it not ultimately been for my wife. She was the catalyst, and I'm not saying that it was easy. It really came between us. I don't know how we lasted through our relationship lasted as a result of these differences, because she really hadn't been raised in a Bible student culture. Even though her father was an avid Bible student, he was isolated. Her mother was Unitarian. She was very much opposed to her husband's religion, and she made it difficult for religious topics to be discussed around the home. If this religious topics were discussed, they were done in whispers, basically. And I always found that strange, that we had to hide what we were discussing in my wife's home. But religion was a no-no in my in-laws' home, even though my father-in-law was a dyed-in-the-wool Bible student, Russellite. And so my wife never really had the upbringing that I had. The indoctrination didn't go nearly as deeply with her as it was with me, especially the cultural aspects of the Bible students and the expectations. And so behavioral expectations. So there was a lot of conflict between us as a result. And eventually that conflict led to my questioning. But it took a long, long, long time. I have to admit, it was very, very tough, because it was so deeply seated within my psyche and within my beliefs and what I was what I believed in, that it took an awful lot of controversy, of head to head, basically all out war at times to finally shake and awake me from the sleep that I was under in the Bible students. I mean, I was all in, basically, in the Bible students. I knew what my expectations as a consecrated, baptized Bible student were, and that the consequences of denying my baptism, denying my consecration, were likely second death. And that was always held over your head as a Damocles sword, to keep you in the straight and narrow, sort of as hell is used by the fundamentalists, by the Catholic Church until recently. They've lightened up on the hell idea a bit. But the fundamentalist Christians, evangelicals, they still use hell as a intimidation factor to keep you in line. And second death was the same thing. They just basically an analog to the concept of hell. But this documentary I think is great, and I think it's important. This is an important subject. I think that enlightening the population in general to the problem is necessary, and I don't think it just takes one documentary. I think it takes constant work, because these people are putting these, by allowing these individuals to remain in their congregations, is putting society at large in jeopardy, because it keeps these individuals active, as opposed to them being put in jail or getting some let's say psychological help, let's say in a psych ward or whatever it is that they do. But these people are put on a watch list for sexual abusers. The Jehovah's Witness system of things doesn't allow that to happen. These people are going are in society under the radar, being protected by the society's policies, and they're going door to door, knocking on doors and scouting out territories where they may prey, because these individuals are indeed predators. So anyway, I haven't been feeling well lately. Over the last couple of months, I have had some symptoms that required me to go through a whole battery of tests. I'm still waiting for the outcome of these tests. I may need more procedures. I have to wait at this point and see. We did find out some things, and I got to watch myself. So if I do happen to get a little thinner over the course of the next year, that's a good thing, and I hope that happens. But I'm happier now, despite these circumstances of the last couple of months. I'm happier now than I've ever been. I've also been working on my math YouTube channel. I don't know, what people's opinions are. I've only got 5 subscribers. But I am having fun putting up these videos. I have a little whiteboard, and I've finished a series of 7 videos on trigonometry. I did a slide presentation on the fundamentals of geometry. I just finished 2 videos on introduction to algebra and some key concepts in algebra, and I'm going to be working on exponentials and logarithms soon, and so I'm really having fun with that. I call myself Math Man, M-A-T-H, a separate word. It's not all together, Math Man. 2 separate words, capital M-A-N-N. That's my site. I still use the pentagram as a symbol, and the only reason I use a pentagram has nothing to do with Satanism or any of that other stuff. It's part of the Fibonacci and golden numbers, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Eventually, I'll be putting on some videos on my math channel regarding Fibonacci numbers. I hope to eventually go through calculus, some of the fundamental aspects of calculus, maybe even some little higher levels of calculus. There are some really cool things. I just love mathematics. Matt Dillon, he keeps talking about how science is a quest for truth, but it isn't